The rumor on Crestwood Lane was that the gardener at the white brick mansion never spoke. He arrived before sunrise, left after dusk, and in between he only touched earth. The mansion belonged to Elliot Whitmore, a man whose name glowed on brass, plaques and museum donor walls whose jawline always looked sharpened by the last deal he'd made. Elliot worked behind glass, laptop screens, limo windows, the plate glass panels of his office. So when he first noticed the gardener's hands, he felt something unfamiliar stir, curiosity. The gardener's name was Samuel Baptiste. He was tall and strong, but moved with care as if the wind could bruise the things he carried. His skin was dark and smooth like oiled mahogany. His palms were pale and calloused, the kind of hands that knew not just work, but a kind of listening. His accent lilted in rare moments, syllables rolling like small waves against a dock. The neighbors said he was from somewhere in the Caribbean, though the Caribbean is many somewheres. What they did know was this: the beds he planted never looked like anyone else's. Not just borders and circles and tidy rows, but arcs nested inside arcs, spirals that seemed to breathe, clusters that almost hummed. From upstairs, when Elliot looked down at the back lawn from his balcony, the beds made shapes that made his eyes twitch. They were too intentional. He found himself loitering at the railing with his coffee cooling, zooming in on photos with his thumb and forefinger until the pixels broke apart, but the questions did not. It wasn't that Elliot cared about flowers. He cared about results. His father had raised him to hunt answers as if they were animals that would bolt at the slightest noise. He'd built his fund on that instinct, on staying 2 minutes faster than the room. But there was a slowness in the garden that unsettled him, a patience and a secrecy that made him feel locked out of his own land. One morning in late March, when the light was honest and thin and the grass smelled wet and faintly metallic, he went outside and stood near the biggest bed, hands shoved deep in his coat. "You repeat shapes," he said without preamble. Samuel's spade paused in the soil. He glanced up and then back down. "Shapes repeat themselves," he said. "What does that mean?" "Same as the tide," Samuel said, easing a root ball into a neat hole. "It does not argue with the moon." Elliot wanted to ask more, but felt oddly foolish. He thought about telling the gardener to plant like everyone else, to keep it simple, like a haircut that doesn't make noise. Instead, he said, "Carry on," and retreated to the house, where he spent an hour pretending to care about a compliance memo while his thumb hovered over his camera roll, flipping between pictures of pansies, violas, ornamental kale set in, swoops, and the greenish blur of lawn between them. He noticed that when he traced the beds in his mind, there were returns to the same curve, like a chorus. The neighbors noticed too, but with less patience. They were narrow people with broad opinions about hedges. "It's art gone wrong," Cynthia said when she visited, her eyelashes weighing down her lids like velvet curtains. "It looks like a language I can almost read." It sounded like a complaint until Elliot caught the fear in it, the prickle, of what are we not seeing, and laughed more than he meant to. That night he dreamed of standing in a library where every book was bound in leaves. The first incident happened in April. Elliot came home late, the kind of late that smells like whiskey and victory, and saw a streak of trampled begonias near the east lawn. It might have been the housekeeper taking a shortcut to the rubbish bins, except a piece of wood lay near the shed, a small plank with its end carved into a point. A stake. He picked it up and thought of fences and borders, and the way his father's voice had sounded when he said, "Never let anyone plant on your ground." In the morning, a circle of pansies looked stepped on, a bite taken out of a letter mid-sentence. He found Samuel standing silently at the damage, chin tilted as if listening to a pain. "Vandals?" Elliot asked. "Wind does not leave footprints," Samuel said. He stood the trampled stems back up with his fingers. It seemed like mercy. "Do you want me to put up cameras?" Samuel looked at him then, fully, and Elliot felt pinned to his own lawn. "Cameras will see eyes, not hands." "Whose hands?" Elliot asked, not liking how quickly the conversation had tilted. He was the homeowner. He should own this moment, too. Samuel didn't answer. He shook the dirt from his trowel and began to replant. Elliot did install cameras. He told himself it was sensible, not suspicious. In the footage that night, a figure darted along the shadow of the hedgerow and knelt briefly at the east bed. The angle was bad. He couldn't see the face. Just the certainty of the posture, the way the gloved hands pressed down, not to plant, but to smother. The footage left Elliot cold. He sat in the dark of his study staring at the paused image. 2. Hands motionless in his field of view, and realized he didn't know his neighbors at all. He had been generous with donations and stingy with attention. The next day, he'd have his security firm adjust the angles and the lighting. For a few hours, his fear of the gardener's secrets shrank before a new fear: the meanness of people, who took offense to beauty they didn't understand. By May, the patterns grew more intricate, and the trouble grew stranger, too. A stone appeared in the middle of the lawn one morning. Not a field stone, but a chunk of something like limestone, carved crudely with a small spiral. Elliot would have dismissed it as a prank if he hadn't seen the spiral before, over and over. In the garden itself, a shape that belonged to Samuel's hands. He asked his housekeeper, Lydia, if she'd moved the stone for mowing, and she crossed herself and said in her Polish accent, "I would not touch things like that, sir." He carried the weight of the stone in his arms and felt how old it was, how the corkscrew shape had been scratched by a dull blade and intention. He found Samuel near the jasmine trellis, his face turned to the air as if measuring a scent. "This yours?" Elliot asked, showing him the rock. Samuel touched the spiral with his thumb as if reading Braille in reverse. "No. Do you know what it is?" "Some wound that healed wrong," Samuel said. He took the stone and placed it at the corner of a bed, as if accepting an insult, and returned to work. Elliot didn't know why that sentence rattled in his head. Some wound that healed wrong, until a few days later, when a man named Gerald from the neighborhood association stopped by, in a tan sweater the exact color of porridge, and said, "Some of us are concerned about your gardener's unconventional approach. What you mean is you don't like looking at something you can't categorize in 5 seconds, Elliot said. Gerald smiled with 3 teeth and a budget. "We all appreciate artistry. It's just, there's been talk that the arrangements are tribal." "I didn't know flowers had passports," Elliot said, and Gerald pretended to laugh and then suggested fines and bylaws and other ways to make life small. After he left, Elliot walked the garden in long strides, feeling a heat he usually reserved for boardrooms. He had been so caught up in wanting to read the message that he'd forgotten there were people who wanted to erase it. He caught Samuel on his way out and said, "There's pressure to normalize this." "What is normal?" Samuel asked, wiping his hands on an old cloth. "A body without scars," Elliot said, surprising himself. Samuel's mouth tilted. "Scars tell you where not to cut again." "Tell me what it means," Elliot said, the impatience finally rushing out. Samuel studied his face for a long moment, then looked past him into the garden, as if asking permission from the beds themselves. "I am not secret for the joy of it," he said quietly. "Some things live better if they are not dragged hungry into the light." "I own the light here," Elliot said. He heard how brutal that sounded and winced. "You own the lamps," Samuel said. "The light, it is older." He left, and Elliot was alone with his arrogance. He walked to the east bed, the one that had been trampled, and crouched. Orange. Marigolds formed a curve that, if he extended it in his mind, would become a spiral. White alyssum dotted the negative space like stars. A cluster of purple petunias sat apart, a little island. The longer he stared, the more he felt like he stood at the edge of a word. That night, he printed all the aerial photos he'd taken since March and spread them on his dining table. He pushed plates aside and scissored edges until the beds met. Just so. When he aligned the east lawn in April with the west bed in May and the narrow strip along the hedgerow in June, a shape appeared. Not random, not simple. A twisted ladder came into view, made of curved lines and small offshoots, the negative spaces stitched with white. He knew that shape from a childhood book, a kind of fishbone pattern. No, not a fish, a symbol. He Googled, until the screen light burned his eyes. Adinkra, Akan, Yoruba, Kalinago, Taino petroglyphs, dreadlocked spirals, symbols for journey, for return, for memory. He found nothing that exactly matched. He slept badly, and in the half-dream before, dawn, a voice like a radio not quite tuned, said, "You do not know the alphabet." The second incident did not feel like a prank at all. It felt like malice. Someone had poured salt at the base of a dozen flowers along the west lawn. Elliot saw the pale crystals winking in the morning light like spilled teeth. He knelt to brush the salt away and rubbed at his eyes with grainy fingers, swore, and kept brushing until the dirt looked clean again. When he looked up, Samuel was there, silent. "I've asked security to patrol," Elliot said. "We'll catch whoever it is." "It is not a person you will catch with patrol," Samuel said. "It is a fear. It moves from face to face." What are they afraid of? Flowers? Being told a story that does not start with them. The words rang through Elliot like a bell struck deep in a cathedral. He thought of his father, who began every story with a Whitmore. He thought of his own empty house, a museum of taste and money but not life. He thought of how he'd assumed that hiring a gardener meant ordering nature to behave. When had he decided that everything he touched should submit? A week later, he found a book tucked behind the jasmine trellis, wrapped in oilcloth and twine. It might have been there for days. The cloth smelled faintly of old smoke and something medicinal. Elliot untied it. The book was small, its cover buckled by damp, its pages a mix of handwriting and pasted clippings. On the inside cover, in pencil, a name, Amélie Baptiste, 1969. He carried it inside with the care of someone carrying a baby he had not expected to hold. The handwriting was neat and angled with a dancer's balance. The entries were not dated by day, but by weather, by the mood of the sea. He flipped to the middle and read, "The mango tree remembers better than any of us. If you plant sorrow under it, it will fruit bitter for your children. Turn the soil. Speak forgiveness. Plant color like a hymn." On another page, a pressed leaf was taped beside a story of a girl running barefoot along a sugar road. On another, a sketch of a spiral, annotated, "Hurricane Eye, calm center. Round me is the noise. At center is the voice." There were references to islands Elliot had only visited with cocktails in his hand, islands he had never known could be crowded with ancestors. There was a list of flowers, marigold for remembrance, jasmine for longing, white alyssum for little, wisdoms, petunia for anger, tamed. The notes looked like a recipe half stolen and half inherited. He realized two things at once. The book belonged to Samuel's mother, and the garden was writing sentences in the language of color. He was halfway to the back door when his intercom buzzed. "Mr. Whitmore," Lydia said, a tremor in her voice. "The gardener, he is bleeding." By the east hedgerow, Samuel sat on the lawn with his back against a clipping bin, breath shallow, a slice across his forearm, not deep but red and stubborn. His eyes were bright with pain more than the wound, as if he had hurt something inside, him tenderer than flesh. Elliot knelt, pressing his handkerchief to the cut. "What happened?" "Fence wire," Samuel said. "Someone pulled it loose and left it like a snake." He said it without heat, the way a sailor might report the weather. In that moment, with blood wicking through white linen, Elliot felt his stomach drop with a realization so simple it embarrassed him. He cared if this man was hurt. Not for liability, for him. "Hospital," Elliot said, already standing, already planning the route. "Bandage," Samuel said, already shaking his head. "Plants don't stop because the gardener is soft." "You're not soft," Elliot said, more sharply than he intended. He took him inside, cleaned the cut at the kitchen sink, wrapped it with gauze, and placed the oilcloth-wrapped book on the counter. "I found this." Samuel looked at the bundle without touching it, and a muscle jumped near his eye. "Where?" Jasmine Trellis. "Then it wanted to be found," he said, and only then did his hand move to hold the book. He had the look of someone receiving a message from the dead. They sat at Elliot's kitchen table, men separated by decades and wealth and kingdoms of experience, sharing the fragile quiet that follows a broken thing being mended. After a while, Elliot said, "Your mother's?" Samuel nodded. "She planted for people who had forgotten their own stories. She said plants will hold what your hands are too tired to carry. We left when the storms got bigger and the boats smaller. But she taught me to read what was growing and to answer it." "What is the garden saying?" Elliot asked. Samuel turned the book to a page where a spiral was sketched again, this time with a dotted line that moved inward and a line that moved out. "We had a storm when I was small," he said, staring somewhere past the cabinets. "A big one. Took our roof, took our goat, took my little sister's blue dress off the line and flung it to the mangroves like a prayer flag. We found her 2 days later sitting in the church, shoes full of mud and eyes full of sky. She had followed. The flowers." He tapped the page. Mama had planted them along the path home, white, low to the ground. "A ribbon of mercy." Elliot swallowed. The kitchen felt suddenly too bright. "So this pattern is a road," Samuel said. "The bends are the places you think you are lost. The white spaces are the calm at the center. The blossoms are memory stones." "A road for who?" "For a boy," Samuel said. "For me. For whoever lives in this house now." He looked at Elliot then, really looked. And the look was not humble. It was level. "I plant them because when I came here, I was afraid I would disappear, not from the world, but from myself. Money makes a hum that drowns out names. I needed to hear my own. Maybe you needed to hear yours." Elliot found himself without defense. He thought of his father's last words, which had been instructions about trustees rather than love. He thought of the day he'd signed the papers on the Whitmore estate and felt nothing but the private satisfaction of a win tallied. He had never considered the house as something that could hold or break a story. "What about the vandals?" he asked. "Why the sabotage? Why the salt?" Samuel closed the book. "There is a man," he said reluctantly. "Works for the association sometimes. Lives on Elm. When I was planting the first spiral, he told me I was making a mess. He put his boot on a marigold and pressed. I told him we were all guests on the soil, and he said, 'Not all of us.'" Elliot felt a quality of rage rise in him that he usually funneled into negotiations. "Gerald," he said, the name tasting like chalk. "Maybe," Samuel said, "or someone who listens to him." "We'll handle it," Elliot said. "No more mercy, not for this." "Mercy is not for them," Samuel said softly. "It is for us, so we don't turn into what we fight." He slipped the book into the oilcloth again and tied it like a simple gift. That night, Elliot didn't sleep. He walked the garden at 2 in the morning, the cut grass smell thick, the air electric with summer coming. He took pictures from ground level, moved along the paths the bed suggested, let his feet obey the logic of the shapes. He thought of his own childhood, of the small patch of dirt behind the rental his mother had kept after his father left, where a single misfit rosebush threw up blooms as if defying the math of neglect. He had forgotten that rose until now. He had forgotten so many things. The garden made them come back like birds who'd learned he had seed. He installed more lights, not to catch a perpetrator, but to bathe the beds in a gentler honesty. He told security to stop prowling and start sitting, to be watchers, not hunters. He wrote a brusque email to the association with words like unlawful and harassment and municipal code, and then he wrote a second note to Samuel with words he used. Sparingly, I am sorry I asked you to share before you were ready. I am listening now. In June, the flowers peaked, the beds flushed with marigolds and jasmine, and white alyssum humming with bees. Children from 2 houses down began riding their scooters slowly past the hedgerow and peeking through as if looking at a lit stage. One afternoon, Elliot saw a girl in braids stand by the east bed and copy the shape of the spiral with her finger on her palm. Her mother stood a little ways off and watched too. The girl looked up at Elliot on the balcony and said, "It's a maze you don't get lost in." "It's a map," Elliot called down, surprising himself with the urge to explain without owning. "For where?" she asked. "For here," he said, and touched his chest. The third incident was not sabotage, but grief. A fast storm muscled in from the coast and dropped a fist of hail on Crestwood Lane. Leaves shredded, blossoms bruised. The air afterwards smelled like cold iron and broken stems. Elliot stood at the window and felt a tenderness so sharp he had to hold on to the sill. He went out in his dress shirt and kicked off his shoes and crouched among the ruined pansies, trying to tuck their faces back up. Across the lawn, he saw movement near the hedgerow and hustled over, heart clenching with the anticipation of another piece of malice. But it was only a rabbit as damp as a rag, hunched and blinking. He laughed aloud, a ridiculous sound in the rain. He had become a man who laughed at a rabbit. The next morning, Samuel arrived with a flat of new blooms and a bag of something that smelled sweet and loamy. "Comfrey tea," he said, "for healing." "For plants? For men if they are humble enough to drink it?" "Am I?" Elliot asked wryly. "Not yet," Samuel said, and hoisted the bag onto his shoulder. They worked together that day. Elliot held stems while Samuel slid them into the soil. He learned to loosen the root ball rather than yank it free, to firm the dirt with the heel of his hand, not his impatience. He learned that gardening was not peace, but persistence. He sweated through his shirt and didn't care. He asked about the island, about mangoes that tasted like dessert and goats that acted like uncles, about the church with the blue shutters. Samuel told him stories without drama, and Elliot learned that a life need not be embellished to be dazzling. At lunch, Samuel sat on the back steps and sipped from a thermos. He stared across the lawn at the largest spiral, quiet. "When I was 12, he said, I learned a song about hurricanes. The chorus said, 'If you can't find the road, look for the flowers. If you can't find the flowers, plant them.' My sister used to sing it in a wrong key. She sang like the storm was a joke we would play on if we were brave enough." "Where is she now?" Elliot asked carefully. "In a hair salon on a street with 5 churches, Samuel said. "She calls me and tells me who is marrying whom. She tells me which of our cousins drinks too much and which has begun to paint. She says she dreams of our mother speaking to the mango tree. Sometimes she sends me a picture. I send her the garden." "You send her pictures of this?" Elliot asked, a little thrilled. "Sometimes," Samuel said. "Sometimes I just send her the light through the jasmine." "You're making me sentimental," Elliot said. "I am making you remember," Samuel said. A week later, the association scheduled an emergency meeting regarding landscaping that departs from community standards. Elliot showed up in a linen blazer that cost a sin and a t-shirt that cost faith. He'd printed out aerial photos of the garden and then a quote from a municipal ordinance about homeowners' rights to aesthetic expression. He prepared to argue like he argued at work, win with words, pin with precedent. But when he stood and looked at the room, at Gerald and his sweater, and 3 of his clones, and a woman named Evelyn, who had written letters to the editor about lawn heights, he felt a tiredness like sand in his bones. He realized he no longer wanted to dominate rooms like this. He wanted to invite them into something better. "My gardener is telling a story," he said simply, holding up a photo of the spiral blooming with marigolds. "It's a story of memory and home and the ways we survive storms. If you can't read it, that's not his failure. It's yours. And maybe mine, for living among you without asking who you were beyond your hedges." He put the ordinance on the table but didn't lean on it. "You can find me if you want. I'll pay and keep planting." "Stories are for books, not lawns," Gerald said, leeching all the joy from his sentence. "Stories are for wherever people can see them," Elliot said. A woman in the back, small, gray-haired, with the kind of eyes that had seen more than the block, cleared her throat. "My husband has dementia," she said. "We walk past that garden, and he points at the white flowers and says, 'Home.' He hasn't said home outside of the house in months." She folded her hands and looked at Gerald with a gaze that did not beg. "Keep the flowers." That night, Elliot and Samuel stood together at the edge of the largest bed, the twilight making the marigolds look lit from within. "You won," Samuel said. "No," Elliot said. "We did." He was embarrassed at the "we" and at the simplicity of the sentence, but the embarrassment felt like a skin he could shed. Summer ripened. The garden became a song that people began to hum even if they didn't know the words. Strangers slowed their cars. A young couple took engagement photos by the jasmine, then brought the prints to the door in a small envelope tied with a ribbon. Elliot put the photo on his fridge, a place previously reserved for condiments. He realized he wanted more of that. Milk carton magnets and childish drawings and the casual intimacy of a life that wasn't arranged like a showroom. He also realized something else. The pattern, the road, was not finished. There was a section along the north hedge where the beds were sparse, a sentence that abruptly ended mid-verb. He stood there one evening with the oilcloth book in his hands and flipped to a page where Amelie had drawn a shape like a hook. Not a fish hook, something older. The note beside it read, "For the part you do not yet know, leave ground ready, plant patience." He almost laughed. He had never planted patience in his life. He had monetized it. "Why isn't the road complete?" he asked Samuel the next morning. Samuel tilted his head. "Because you have not finished walking it." "How do we finish?" "We do not," Samuel said. He pointed at the bare strip. "We just continue. Put something here that will close and open at once." "What does that even mean?" Samuel didn't answer with words. He walked to the truck and came back with a flat of small seedlings. Their leaves a glossy, determined green. "Blue porterweed," he said. "It will call butterflies. They will make the air say thank you." They planted in silence. Butterflies did come, dazzling as mistakes forgiven. Elliot stood very still and felt a tear slide, and he let it. He did not wipe it away like an accident. He was tired of behaving as if tenderness were an error. In late August, the man from Elm, whether Gerald or his echo, returned. Elliot didn't see him, but he saw what he left. A strip of broken stems near the north hedge, blue porterweed, bent at ugly angles. He also saw, tucked under a stone, a note made of cut-out magazine letters, "Enough." He felt the old battle-hardness surge. Call the police, pursue charges, crush. He called Samuel first. "We can replant," Samuel said. "We will replant, but first we will leave it like this for a day." "Why?" "So the wound shows. So whoever did this must see they did not stop a hand. They only made a bruise. They left it for a day. The next morning, a different note lay there, not cut-out letters, but a child's printing in pencil. "I'm sorry my dad did this. He says gardens are for women. I like your flowers." The note was folded around a small packet of seeds. Sunflower seeds, the cheap kind you buy in bulk. Samuel read the note and smiled a small, private smile. "Plant them," he said to Elliot. "Here?" Elliot asked. "Here," Samuel said, "where the bruise is. Let height come out of hurt." They planted the sunflowers. The stems shot up like promises. By September, the flower heads were heavy and butter yellow, and the kid whose note it had been walked by with his father and did not look, and then looked. Elliot stood at the mailbox pretending he was useless with keys until the boy whispered, "Thank you," and the father stared hard at the pavement as if it contained rules he had not mastered. Elliot began to change in ways that announced themselves not as revelations, but as rearrangements. He took calls outside so he could look at the marigolds while someone lied to him about numbers. He bought a basket at the farmer's market instead of a bag because he liked the feeling of carrying something generous. He wrote to his sister, whom he saw only at holidays, warehouses in rented suits. He invited her to the garden. She came with her daughter, who was allergic to bees and not to joy. They ate cold chicken on the steps and talked about their mother's stubborn rosebush and laughed until Lydia asked if it was anyone's birthday, because the sound made the house feel full. One evening, when the light was the color of old honey, Samuel brought a small stone from the back of his truck and placed it at the center of the largest spiral. The stone had a hole through it, worn by water and time. "In my island," he said, "we called this an eye stone. You look through it and see what is under the water. Fish, rocks, the shape of the current. You can also look through it and see who you are, if you are brave." Elliot crouched and put the stone to his eye. The garden collapsed into a small circle rimmed by the world. He saw a path of white alyssum like milk, spilt on green, the orange curve of marigolds like palmed sun, the first stars of jasmine. He saw his own shoe, scuffed. He saw a future he did not know how to price. "Do you ever miss it?" Elliot asked. "Your island?" "I never left it," Samuel said. "I came here with it. It came here with me." "Will you teach me the alphabet?" Elliot asked, suddenly shy. Samuel's smile was a quiet sunrise. "You already began." Autumn leaned in. The marigolds lasted longer than anyone predicted, stubborn like good memories. The jasmine stilled and saved itself for next year. Elliot walked in a sweater he used to wear only to planes and found himself taking slower breaths. He caught himself narrating the garden in his head like a story to someone not yet born. He wondered if that was the first step toward wanting a child. He panicked at the thought, then laughed at the panic, then kept walking. One night, the past came to the door. A man in a suit, the kind of man Elliot used to be in Mirror and Mind, stood on the stoop holding a slim folder. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "your father's estate has a matter that concerns you." Inside the folder was a letter written years ago, but held by a lawyer who had finally run out of instructions. The letter, in his father's thin hand, said, "You will want to make everything bend. Do not bend the wrong things. I bent your mother, until she broke and she took the garden with her. If you ever find another garden, listen to it." Elliot stared until the words became a blur of ink and regret. He folded the letter carefully, as if it could uncrumple the past. He took it outside and sat on the back step. The air was cold enough to hurt. Samuel was coiling a hose, his breath a small cloud. Elliot handed him the letter without comment. Samuel read and then put his hand flat on the paper as if blessing it. "He tried to warn me," Elliot said. "He tried," Samuel said. "Now you are listening." "Do you think plants forgive?" Samuel considered. Plants remember and begin again. That is stronger. The first frost took the tender things. The garden browned and thinned. Underneath, roots did their invisible work. Elliot learned that gardeners are not just coaxers of beauty, but managers of endings. He learned to cut back what wanted to rot and to leave what wanted to feed the soil. He learned that to keep something, you sometimes have to take a knife to it. He learned to do it with mercy. Winter on Crestwood Lane was tidy. The neighbors lit their shrubs like department stores. Elliot left the beds unlit, dark shapes under clean snow. He walked them anyway, crunching carefully along paths he no longer needed to see to know. He called his sister more. He sent Samuel's sister a card, awkward and sincere, with a photo of the garden in late summer and a note that said, "Thank you for singing off-key." In January, in a coffee shop whose pastries he could not believe he'd missed for 5 years, Elliot met a woman named Mara who ran the community garden on the edge of town, in the lot behind the laundromat. She spoke about seed saving as if it were smuggling the future past the gate. He found himself saying words like beds and succession, planting, and discovered he had accidentally become a person who could talk to a gardener without pretending. He brought Mara to the house. He introduced her to Samuel like a student brings a friend to meet a teacher. She walked the beds with reverent steps and then looked at Samuel with open admiration. "Your writing," she said simply. "It's beautiful." "It is my mother's handwriting," he said. In early spring, a package arrived from an island with 5 churches. Inside were 2 things: a scarf printed with tiny spirals and a note in careful script. "Plant a mango pit for me. It will not grow, but put it in the ground anyway, so the soil learns our family name. Love, your sister." Samuel brought the pit to the garden, held it like a relic, and dug a shallow home for it near the jasmine. He placed it, patted the soil as if tucking in a child, and stood a long time. Elliot stood with him. They did not speak because the silence was already saying everything. April brought back color like forgiveness. The beds woke slowly, yawning green. The first alyssum buttons appeared, then the edges of marigold leaves, then the jasmine, shy at first, and then, suddenly, graceless, in its abundance. People returned to the fence just to breathe. The little girl with braids, now missing a front tooth, announced that she would be having her birthday party in the garden. Elliot said yes before remembering that adults negotiate. "You can, blow your candles by the eye stone," he said, and the girl gasped as if given a crown. On the morning of the party, Samuel arrived in a shirt that had seen weddings and funerals. He carried his mother's book and set it on the picnic table as if it needed to witness. When the cake came out, a simple circle with white frosting and yellow flowers piped around the edge, Elliot realized how much he loved the sound of children near his house. He had hoarded silence for years, and now it seemed like a fixed income that paid too little. After the party, after the last paper plate had been tossed and the last smear of frosting wiped, he and Samuel sat under the jasmine. The air smelled like the memory you hope returns. "I keep thinking about your phrase," Elliot said. "The calm at the center." "It is there even when we cannot find it," Samuel said. "We do not summon it. We arrive." "How do you arrive?" "Sometimes by getting lost first." Elliot laughed softly. "That I can arrange." He took out his phone and scrolled to a picture he had taken that morning from the balcony. The beds were more complete now. The road curved and coiled and uncoiled. The sunflowers' dry heads leaned like elders listening. Near the north hedge, where the bruise had been, a drift of blue wildflowers was opening, the color of a sky you could drink. He held the phone beside the book, the drawn spiral next to the planted one, and saw a hinge between them. What you inherit and what you build. "Do you ever feel angry?" he asked suddenly. "About what people said, about the boots on the marigolds." "Angry, yes," Samuel said. I do not carry it long. It is heavy. I put it in the ground and ask it to be food. Does that work? Look around. Elliot did. He saw a lawn that had been a stage and had become a language. He saw his own complicity dissolve like salt in rain. He saw a friend, which is to say he saw the person across from him without wanting to use him. He saw a future that looked less like a plan and more like a path. A week later, as if the garden required a last test, a city inspector arrived with a clipboard and a halting apology. "We received a complaint," he said, not meeting Elliot's eyes, "about unconventional land use." "Is it against the law to be unconventional?" Elliot asked mildly. He had the ordinance at the ready, but he kept it pocketed. The inspector shuffled. "No, sir. Well, I had to come look." He followed Elliot into the yard, took 2 steps, and stopped. His face changed the way faces do when the heart catches up to the eyes. He walked the paths, put his hand out, without touching, sat on the bench for a long moment. He stood, cleared his throat, and said, "Beautiful," like a verdict. He signed his own form and left. In the evening, as the last gold lay down like a coin on the lawn, Elliot and Samuel planted a small plaque near the eye-stone. It did not say Whitmore or Baptiste or anything as declarative as ownership. It said only, "The road back." Beneath, in smaller letters, "For anyone who needs it, people came." Not crowds, this was not a tourist site, but the kind of people who notice. A nurse in scrubs standing very still with her hands on her hips. A teenager who pretended to look at his phone and then took a picture when he thought no one saw. A man with a cane who walked the curves slowly and breathed louder when he finished. Elliot watched from the kitchen sometimes, his chest full in a way that made his old triumphs look cheap. One late afternoon, a man Elliot had never seen before stood at the mouth of the largest spiral, hat in his hands, eyes rimmed red. He lifted his head when he heard footsteps. "I'm from St. Lucia," he said to Samuel, who had approached without a word. "I heard there is a road here." "There is," Samuel said. "Does it go home?" the man asked. "It goes to the center," Samuel said. "From there you can go anywhere." The man nodded, then walked slowly in, the flowers bowing a little as if to make room. By the time summer rolled back a second time, Elliot was different in ways that would have mortified his old self and delighted the boy who had loved a scrappy rosebush behind a rented house. He cooked badly for friends and did not apologize for it. He drove to the community garden on Saturdays with a trunk full of compost and stayed to listen. He dated Mara and learned that intimacy has its own alphabet, too. He made money with less blood in it. He called his sister every Sunday. He dreamed in color again. One evening, as dusk thinned and the jasmine leaned into sweetness, he found Samuel sitting on the bench, the oilcloth book open on his lap. Elliot sat beside him. The silence felt like a stitch. After a while, Samuel said, "My mother wrote one more page at the back." He turned the book and showed him the last entry, the ink fainter, the letters less tidy. It read, "If I forget, remind me. If I remember, sing with me. It is the same song." They sat a long time. Finally, Elliot said, "You planted a road that changed me." Samuel closed the book gently. "No," he said. "You walked it." "And you?" Elliot asked. "What changed for you?" Samuel looked toward the north hedge where the sunflowers were heavy and dignified. "I have been making roads for years," he said. "This is the first time someone asked me where they led." In the last light, the garden seemed to exhale. Somewhere a child laughed. Somewhere a dog barked once, and then thought better of it. A moth bumbled the jasmine. The air was that moment before lamps, holy and brief. "Will it last?" Elliot asked suddenly, the old fear pricking. "Will it all last? The patterns, the feeling, this?" "This," Samuel said and smiled. "Nothing stays as it is. Everything stays as it means." That's not comforting. It is honest, Samuel said. Besides, you know the way now. They stood. The beds in the half-dark were shadows of their daytime selves, like memories you can only touch with your eyes closed. Elliot reached out and let his fingers brush the ruffled edge of a marigold. "Thank you," he said, the words quiet and full. Samuel nodded once. "Plant patience," he said. "You will need more." "I will," Elliot said. They walked the spiral together, not talking, the path folding in and then out. The white, alyssum, blinking like small stars under their feet. At the center, they stood very still. The world hummed its low, eternal hum. Beyond the hedge, Crestwood Lane waited with its mail and its mortgages and its misunderstandings. In the garden, there was the calm at the center and the road out of it. It was enough. It was more than enough.